Hi, so today I want to discuss an article in Catholic Answers. It's from Catholic.com, and the title of the article is Unless You're Judas, Antinatalism Fails. The subtitle, Here's How Catholics Can Debunk the Argument That Suffering, Whether Trivial or Severe, Means Life is Not Worth Living. I don't know of any parent in their right mind that would think a child they're about to give birth to would suffer extremely severe circumstances and still give birth to that child. Whether you're Catholic or religious or non-religious, I just don't see a parent making that choice. Say there's going to be some genetic defect or some sort of painful disease or something that your child is going to be born into just by mere existence. I can't imagine any parent doing that on purpose. And even if it means being closer to Jesus or whatever, I don't see any parent doing that. So you could cut the severe from the subtitle. There's trivial suffering as well. And this is where they're attacking Benatar on the trivial suffering, that life is worth living because if it's just trivial suffering, the mere value of existence is great enough to discount the suffering. Another thing I want to add to that is death. We all die. You can pray that you die painlessly, but honestly speaking, death comes slowly. We're kind of dying from the moment we're born, really, but death is probably going to come from something like cancer or from dementia, or what I'm trying to say is it's going to involve suffering to some degree or the other, and pretty severe suffering, I would say. Not always, as I said, not always, but I would say most times it would involve suffering. And then there's death itself, which is an annihilation of life. And that alone is a bad thing. You lose everything, right? And that's pretty damn severe. The whole severe thing in the subtitle could be kind of cut out, but because they don't debunk that. Now, the argument that they're relying on for this whole thing about existence itself being very valuable is the ontological argument for the existence of God. And the author, whose name is Paul Senz, so Paul Senz, he's implying something here with the ontological argument for God's existence. So two things are happening. There's the existence of God, and then there's the existence of a human being. First, he's saying that God's existence is predicated, God's perfection is predicated on existence. But I'm not sure that when you're talking about God, who is a supernatural being, that existence in the conventional sense is worth anything. You're talking about a concept here that's beyond the universe, right? So anything materialist in terms of existing is kind of a dead end. Like you can't get anything from existence. Now, I'm kind of alluding to Kant's takedown of the ontological argument, and Kant said that existence doesn't add anything to an object. The object still maintains all its qualities without existence being one of them. So the example that Kant gave is if he had 100 coins in his 100 gold coins, you could describe those 100 gold coins. You could say they're gold, they're 24 karat gold, the king's face is printed on them, etc., etc. But the fact that they exist or not doesn't actually change any of their qualities. They're still gold and 24 karat, and they still have the king's face printed on them, etc., etc. So existence is not a predicate for the quality of this being that you're describing as God. And in my own little humble addition to that, like I said, when you're talking about God, you're talking about something else. Now, the other part of it is basically human existence, and this is where Paul Senz is kind of describing something here that I don't find very convincing. So he's implying in this paragraph that by bringing people into existence, we're getting closer to God, which is a bit of a contradiction. Maybe not. I mean, you are getting closer to God in the sense that, from the Catholic perspective, you exist, so you're on your way to heaven. So existence is kind of like a stepping stone. But I don't see, from the perspective of the ontological argument, I don't see existence as being closer to perfection or closer to God. Maybe in a temporal sense, but in the Catholic framework, in a temporal sense. But like I said, existence is not a prerequisite for perfection or anything close to it. And one other thing I wanted to throw in there is, doesn't God have an idea? Just like we could think of God as the most perfect being, and if he exists, then he's perfect and he's everything God is. But can't God think of human beings and have that same perfection in his mind? Like, I don't know what God is. Like, I mean, that's the thing about this whole article, right? It's all based on belief, on faith. I was kind of chuckling because none of this makes any sense unless you have faith, and faith by itself is a lack of evidence, right? Its very definition is a lack of evidence. So how do you prove any of this stuff, right? So going back to the human existence, so you exist, you suffer, just like Christ, and then because of that suffering, you're rewarded in heaven. But if you don't exist to begin with, you have no need for heaven. You have no need for heaven or hell or whatever. And if you don't exist, it's safer because you don't end up in hell by accident, right? Or you don't end up in hell because you're born into this world and you're giving the lot that you're given, and then you commit an evil act or multiple evil acts, and then you go to hell. If you don't exist, the chances of that happening, going to hell, are zero. So there's no problem there, right? And as for heaven, if you don't exist, you have no need for heaven. There's no need or desire for heaven. And the last I checked, Catholics don't believe in the pre-existence of souls. They do not believe in the pre-existence of souls, which means you don't exist before you're born, and you don't exist in heaven or hell or anywhere else. Like, when you're born, you're given a soul, and that soul suffers through life and then goes to heaven for that suffering, or goes to hell for the wrong deeds you've committed, right? But Catholics don't believe in that. They don't believe there's a pre-existence of the soul. So if you're thinking about suffering and going to heaven, that's only for people who exist. You have to exist first to want to go to heaven, or to lead a good life or a life of suffering and then go to heaven. If you don't exist, you don't have that. Sorry if I'm repeating myself here. I tend to ramble sometimes, but I'm just trying to get my point across. So maybe I read the paragraph to you and you figure it out for yourself. But yeah, he said, setting aside the question of whether it's possible to be compassionate to someone who doesn't exist, the Catholic philosophical tradition has something to say immediately in response to Benatar's views. Existence is infinitely better than non-existence. We hear this probably most famously in the so-called ontological argument for God's existence, presented by Saint Anselm in the 11th century. Thus, we could never argue that it would be better not to have existed in the first place in order to avoid pain and suffering. Existence in itself is infinitely greater than non-existence, so pain and suffering are outweighed by the good of simply existing. So again, like, existing is imperfect. Human beings are imperfect. It's not like if you exist, that counters the imperfection of the human condition. There's still suffering. Existing doesn't do anything for that. You suffer once you're born. So yeah, that's about it. Like you know, he has a lot to prove here. I mean, he goes into the last part of the article. He goes on about, before, yeah, he goes on about the Catholic, the Catechism, and God's grace and suffering and Jesus Christ and all that stuff. But you have to prove all of that stuff. Like, there's I'm not saying atheism is correct, but what I'm saying is you have to prove that all this stuff exists, like, before you get into antinatalism. Um, and proof is something that the Catholic Church just doesn't have. Um, they could probably go on about, oh, well, if you just look around you, you'll see that God existence is everywhere and blah blah blah. But I mean, yeah, they have to scientifically prove all this stuff before coming to any conclusions, right? But I guess that's the nature of faith, and you're not gonna change people. Like, people are gonna have their faith, and they're gonna think and believe whatever they want. So, yeah, you kind of have to just leave it there. Anyway, that's all I want to say. Yeah, I'm working on my YouTube channel and my website and all that stuff. The website is up and running, spiralvent.ca. It's on a secure connection. I got that fixed up, and yeah, everything's working fine now. I'm not sure who I'm talking to on my YouTube channel. I seem to be talking to seasoned anti-natalists, so I'm not sure how much I'm adding to the conversation, but I'm still going to continue doing videos and stuff. It is a self-education project, so I'm not making any bold claims here. Most of my stuff is derivative. I'm not necessarily reading from a script, but most of my stuff is derivative, which is fine because it's evidence-based and it's logical thought. So I'm not making any, I'm not lying to anybody is what I'm saying. If you want to disagree, you can disagree. That's fine. But yeah, I'm getting there. Anyway, that's all I gotta say. Bye.